Good morning, students. In today's network security lesson, we are going to be discussing about authentication, authorization, and accounting. So, this topic area is generally applicable to all computing applications. So, any software, any systems, or in many places, we will come across this concept around authentication, authorization, and accounting. But today we are going to particularly look at this in the context of network security, and particularly how these principles can be applied when it comes to networking appliances or networking devices, various components that make our networks. So that is the context in which we are going to be discussing these topic areas today. So let's start by identifying these three key components when we particularly talk about AAA or AAA, which is authentication, authorization, and accounting. So what we can see here is authentication is a mechanism to identify someone, that is, to identify who a particular person is or who a particular user is. So that is essentially what authentication is. And authorization is once someone is identified, then determining what they can do, what a particular person can do would be authorization. Then accounting is keeping track of what that person does within our environment. That record of various activities is what we would identify as accounting. The three key components here, AAA. So if we look at that through this simple example here, when we are talking about credit card or bank card activities. So in this context, what we see is the card details, the card number, expiry date, and all these information is what we would identify as authentication. So that is the information that will be used to identifying a user, identifying who a person is. Then authorization in this context would be how much is the credit card limit. So what is the maximum spending that can be done in that card. So that is the authorization, something specific attached to that particular user. Then accounting is where we have all the transactions in the account. The same thing we can look at in various other contexts. Say, for example, if we take in a university environment, within the university environment, the authentication can be used to identify who a particular user is, whether that is a student, that is a teacher, or that is another staff member. So there are various things we can identify with authentication. But once we identify a particular user as a student, then we can give authorization for them to use certain facilities. So they can log into the lab computers if they are identified as a student, and they can use the student Wi-Fi. So there are various things we can also authorize them to do once we do the authentication part. But then when they are in the system, our systems can also keep log of their activities. So if needed, that can be used later on. So again, for example, if you go into the LMS and there you do certain activities, you log into the LMS, you upload files, download things. So all this information can be logged in the back end of the LMS. So that information can be used if that is needed for a purpose of assessing what has been happening within the system later on. So that is essentially accounting in that environment. So we are going to look at these three components and see how these can be applied in a networking setting. So now let's start with each of these components and see how that can be applied in a networking environment. So if we start with authentication first, and with authentication, here it is to identify who a person that is trying to get into the device, get into the networking device. So in this case, we have a router and we are going to see who is the person that is trying to getting into the router. So to do this, here we can have two different approaches. One is known as a local authentication. The other one is a server-based authentication. So if we look at local authentication, for example, this is where the information that is necessary to authenticate the user is all available within the router itself. Say, for example, if we have a user, so and that user tries to log into the device, so they will send a login request, and that login request will be processed at the router end. So it can be processed at the end of the router. So the router will have all the necessary information to do the authentication. So it will have the username, password list there, for example. And once the authentication is done, the router can permit or deny the user accessing the device. An alternative approach to this is where we have a server-based authentication. With server-based authentication, the user would send the request to the router, but the router will use another third-party server, another server to provide this authentication service. So that is where the authentication will happen. So whatever the information that was passed on from the user will be sent over to the authenticating server, and it will send that response back to the router, and the user will be permitted or denied based on that. So that is one of the main components and the two main ways that we can organize authentication, either as local authentication or server-based authentication. So now let's look at how authorization is going to be differing when it comes to in this sort of a network application scenario. So again, the person is going to come into the device and they are going to authenticate themselves. Once they are authenticated, we can establish who that person is. Say, for example, if I am logging in and let's say I am identified as a network administrator in this context. So now my identity, the session that I am logging in, will be identified as an administrator is trying to log in. Once that information is known, now the server or the device can allow me to do things that an administrator is allowed to do or that I am allowed to do personally. So that authorization aspect is determining what are the actions that I can perform in that section, in that system. So again, if we go back to some other example, like in the LMS, for example, which is something that most of you would be familiar with. So in the case of LMS, me as a lecturer, I can post lecture content, materials, notes, videos. I can post quizzes, assignments. So I can do all those things. Whereas you as a student are authorized to download some of those information or participate in quizzes or submit assignments, do exams. So these are the things that you are authorized to do. So it's like different categories of users or different individual users can be authorized to do different things. So again, in this context, we can do this using an AAA server, which will be the server that is going to provide authentication, authorization, and accounting. So what that server can do is, we can have that server function as sort of the central repository that all the devices will be communicating to. Say, for example, if I try to log into this router, what would happen is router will try to communicate with the server, with the AAA server, and will establish a session that is particularly specific to that user after the user is authenticated. Once that is done, the requests, the router will request for authorization to do whatever the requested service. So if I'm trying to do something, maybe trying to configure something, change something, the router can go and check the AA server and see if I am allowed to do that thing. So that is essentially what we would identify as authorization in this context. And then accounting is typically a way of identifying what are the different things a user performs within a particular session. So once they are authenticated and then they go on to do various activities within the device, we keep a record of all those activities. So those activities can be recorded for later use, for example. So that is what we essentially identify as accounting in this context. So now let's look at local AAA authentication and how we can configure local AAA authentication, particularly in a router device, in a Cisco router device in this example. So many of the things we will look through some examples, but then you can see how those can be extended further into other type of networking devices and services and so on. So one of the basic configurations that we can do in almost all networking devices is setting up local authentication, local AA authentication. Setting up that is one of the basic things that we would do in most networking devices. Almost most of the managed networking devices, we will do that activity. So here what we essentially do is we add pairs of usernames and passwords into that local router database in this case. So which will be the list of users who will be allowed to access that particular router. So as sort of a step-by-step configuration in a Cisco device, for example, what we do is we go and specify the username, the passwords, and then we go and enable AA on that router, and then we can specify to use those list of logins as part of authentication there. So that is essentially the basic way that we would configure local AAA in a Cisco router device. So here, when we look at some of the authentication methods that we can configure here, so one is enabling like password-based authentication. We can have local authentication with a username database. So in this case, we have a local username database that we can use. So we can have a number of users that we can specify, and they can be authenticated into our system. We can use local case, where the main difference is here that now the passwords are going to be case sensitive. So whether we have capital A or small a, like you mean case sensitive. We can set it up as no authentication necessary, so everyone will be able to access. This is not something that we would ideally do, but in some test cases or some environments, there may be a need for doing that. Then one thing beyond that is using some of these group concepts. So here we can use a different sort of server-based authentication. Again, we can set up those things. So there are a number of additional configurations we can perform in specifying what type of authentication that we want to use within our router devices. So, in addition to the default authentication method that we can specify, we can also specify named authentication methods. So, for example, we can specify what is the type of authentication methods that will be allowed for example, we can categorize something as SSH login. So, we can say for SSH login, these are the type of authentication methods that will be allowed. So we can do certain configurations in that manner as well. Then further to that, we can also specify certain additional parameters. Like, for example, we can say what is the maximum failed attempts that we can allow. So this is something that can be very useful. So because if someone is trying to brute force into a system, they may try different password combinations and things like that. So in such scenarios, like having a maximum limit and then locking out that particular user can be something useful. So that is something that we can configure. So that is maximum attempts allowed to fail. So again, we can configure that type of an approach is also something possible. Then we can look at the other alternative, which is using server-based AAA. So instead of having our login information as part of our device itself, so instead of having the login information local to the devices, we can also do server-based AAA. So we are using a remote server to provide these activities of authentication, authorization, and accounting. This server is the one that is going to manage these processes. So this is also something that we can do with our devices. And this can be something very much useful if we have a larger network with large number of devices. Say, for example, if you only have one router, then configuring that router, configuring user details and everything in that router is not something difficult. We can do that. But say if we have 10 different routers or 20 routers and various other devices, and we need to manage users across all these devices, having a centralized server that is going to do all these things can have quite a lot of benefit. So that is one of the reasons why we may use server-based AA in many applications. So here we can also see like some of the key differences between when we are using local AAA and server-based AAA. With local AA, the communication is between the user and the device itself. There's nothing else involved in that. So the device sends the request to the rather the user sends the request to the device, and the device responds back. So that is essentially the two components participating in this transaction. Whereas in the case of server-based AA, we have the user and we have the device, but then the requests are actually passed on towards or through to the AAA server, and then the responses are again redirected back from the AAA server through the device to the user. And it is also possible to have a number of different servers providing this service. So it doesn't have to be a single server providing all the authentication or all these services. It's possible for a number of servers to be involved in this process as well. So when we are using something like a Cisco Secure Access Control System or Cisco Secure ACS, so which is a server-based authentication mechanism that we can have. So in this scenario, we would use some additional protocols to communicate between these devices. So what we will have is we can have our servers or our devices. Say for example, we have the users and we have the devices. Then we can have different ACS servers that we may use. And to communicate between our devices and these servers, we may use certain protocols, certain specific protocols to perform these communication. So that is something we can note here. That communication part between the devices and the access control systems or AAA servers can use certain specialized or specific communication protocols for that particular purpose. So the two common protocols that are used for communication between AA servers and devices are, one is known as TAC ACS plus, or the other one is Radius. So there are some key differences between these two, and one of the main one being one is predominantly Cisco supported protocol, and the other one is more of an open standard protocol. So between these two communication protocols to communicate with AAA servers and devices, the choice can depend on various factors, whether the device that we have supports one of these protocols or not, whether we have certain additional needs, like for example, what type of encryption or what level of encryption is available. So there are various reasons why we may want to choose one or the other. We are not going to go into much more detail about each of the protocols, but if necessary, you can explore those in a bit more detail. So if we look at particularly the authentication process between TAC ACS plus when we are using that protocol, so the connection or the process is anyway initiated from the client end. So the client is the one that is initiating this process anyway. So that is from the client end. Then when the client requests the device will send it onwards to the ACS server. That server will be the one that is providing the prompt back to ask for the username. So then that is passed on to the user. User will provide the information. That information is passed on to the server. So the device in between is not particularly doing much. It's just performing a passing back and forth activity. Then after that, it will request for the password prompt. It will send that request back, and then the password is provided. That is passed on to the server. So at the very end, whether it is a success or a failed attempt of authentication, whether that authentication request was accepted or not, will be again responded back from the server to the device, because here the user is trying to get into the device. So the device should know whether to allow the user or not. That is the information the server will send back. So that is the information it is expecting from the server. So that is what we will get from there. In the case of radius, for example, just to illustrate slight differences between these two protocols, here this process is somewhat simplified or slightly less involved process, for example. So initially, the device will request for the username. Once the username is provided, it will request a password, and the password is provided. Once all the information is collated at the device level, it will forward that information to the ACS, the access control system, the server, and it will get the response back saying whether that request is accepted or not. So this is one of the key differences between these two protocols. One does like a back and forth through a number of prompts between the server and the client. The other one collates all the information, usernames and password, and then forwards it for authentication and gets the response back. So these are like slightly different implementations of essentially doing the same thing, collecting the username, passwords, and how to authenticate the user. And then when we think about using AAA servers and these communication protocols, we can use them with a variety of AAA servers. The same communication protocols may be used with variety of AAA servers, and there are various options for both these things. Say, for example, one option is if we have Cisco Secure ACS, and we can use TSC ACS Plus as our communication protocol there. So that is something that we can do, or we can even use Radius in that instance. Alternatively, we can use Active Directory or Windows Active Directory as part of our AAA server. Our authentication server is that, because maybe our organization already has an Active Directory for various other purposes, operating systems and all these other things. So we can use the same Active Directory as part of the authentication for our networking devices as well. So in that case, we may need to use Radius as our communication protocol to communicate between Windows Active Directory servers and do the authentication communication there. So depending on what we have, we may use different communication protocols to communicate with different AAA servers. Now, let's briefly look at how we can go about configuring AAA authentication in our devices. That is server-based AAA authentication. So in terms of the high-level steps, it is essentially we start with enabling AAA in our device. Then we have to specify what is the server. What is the server that is going to perform this authentication service. Then we also need to specify some form of secret key to communicate between the device and the server, because there should be an established communication between the server that is providing the service and the router device, because otherwise they can't each communicate with each other. So we need to have some predefined secret that they can use to communicate between themselves. And then we can also specify what is the communication protocol that we are going to use to communicate between these two entities, the authentication servers and the devices. So whether we are going to use radius or TAC ACS or like whatever, we have to specify that as well. So that's a very high level of steps that we will have to follow when we are configuring server-based AAA authentication in our networking devices. So if we look at, for example, in this case, we can specify, say, a TAC ACS server. So we specify that server and we specify the server address. We specify the key and that becomes one authentication model. So we specify an authentication model and we specify what are the specificities in terms of making communication with that server. We can have different servers you communicating through different protocols, so that is possible. So we may have two different servers and each of them can be communicated with different protocols or the same protocol. So that is a possibility there as well. So if we are configuring radius, for example, again, slightly different way of configuring, but essentially the same steps. We specify what is the radius server, the IP address, the ports and all that, then a secret key that becomes the base level configuration that we need to do to specify an AAA server in our device. Then once we do authentication, the next step that we have to take is authorization. So as we identified, authentication is about knowing who the user is, who you are. Authorization is about what you can do. So we can, as we do server-based authentication, we can also do server-based authorization. So that is what we can do here. So in addition to the authentication part, we can also do the authorization part. So with these two particular protocols, TAC-ACS Plus and Radius, TAC-ACS Plus separates authentication from authorization. So those two are done separately. So you first do authentication and then you can do authorization. Whereas with Radius, authentication and authorization are sort of done together, or like those processes are sort of presented together in the protocol. So again, here you can see like some of the basic ways that we can go about configuring the basic authorization model in our networking device, for example. So we can specify the authentication information, and then we can also specify the authorization model. So we can specify what is the protocol that we are going to use, where that will be applied, and all this information can be specified there. Then the third component that we had in AAA is accounting, and again we can do server-based accounting. Again, whatever the activities that has been that a particular user is performing, we try to keep an account of that information so that we can get back to that information if needed later on to analyze what happened, or if something goes wrong, we can come back and trace certain things. So that is the main purpose of doing accounting there. So who was allowed at what time and all these things. So again, like we can do server-based authentication and server-based authorization, we can also configure our devices to use server-based accounting as well. So again, I'm not going to go into the specific details of the configuration commands. Some of these things can be covered in a practical lesson, or there are a number of online resources that I will share that you can refer to in terms of the practical aspects of this and the practical configuration aspects of this. But that can significantly differ from device to device, from manufacturer to manufacturer as well. So that is something to keep in mind as well. So what is essentially expected is that you understand the concepts of AAA, the concepts of authentication, authorization, and accounting, and how that can be used in a network environment, and also thinking about how a server-based AAA approach, a server-based authentication, server-based authorization, and server-based accounting can be used, and what are the advantages and why we may want to use that in our networking environment. So that is the main sort of core principles that you need to understand. Then the specificities of how you may implement that in a particular device, and I think at this level you will be able to figure that out if you are even presented with a new type of device. You normally go to find online resources and do that. So that's not something that we need to focus too much on, but you may easily find this information through some practicals and references. Then another type of authentication that you may come across in network environments is what is known as port-based authentication, or the standard is 802.1x port-based authentication. So with this, what we can do is any device, any end device that is connecting to the network will need to be authenticated before it can be allowed in the network. So earlier what we were trying to do is access the networking devices, access the routers to go into the configuration of the router, how we can authenticate ourselves and get in there. So that is one thing. Here, the device trying to connect to the network, at that point itself we are trying to authenticate to see if that user or if that device will be authenticated into our network. So that is one of the ways that we can do that is using port-based authentication. So in port-based authentication, what we have is we have supplicants. So a supplicant is the device that is going to request access to the network. So it is the one that is going to request access to the network. Then authenticator is the device to which the supplicants are going to connect, and that is the device that is going to allow a device into the network. So that is the one that can have the physical control to block or allow a device to come into the network. But it can use an authentication server to perform the actual authentication. So the authentication server can exist similar to a server-based authentication server. It can exist and provide the actual authentication, but the requests are going through that authenticator switch, for example, in this case. So if we look at the 802.1x message exchange, so that is how a device using 802.1x to authenticate into the network. So it will first request the switch or the authenticator, and it will come back and ask for identity. Once the supplicant provides that information, that is passed directly onto the authentication server. Then server may ask for password, and then the password or whatever the secret information is passed back onto the server. Then it will inform whether it is a successful attempt or not. And if it is a successful attempt, that request process can be concluded, but that connection is now allowed. That device is now part of the network. So that is essentially the way that we would perform port-based authentication. So again, we can look at configuration methods and all that, but we don't need to go into more details about how we configure. So again, as I said, you can refer to some additional resources that will be shared later, your practical lessons and all that, to better practice this. So here you can sort of see a similarity with how we were configuring authentication previously. So here again we'll have to specify an AAA model. We have to specify a radius server. We have to specify the information about the radius server, the IP address, the port number, and all that. The secret key for the radius server. So that part is all fairly similar to how we would have configured previously. The main difference is here we again go into a authorization and specify this applies to a .x, .1x, which is a port-based authentication. So it applies for that particular purpose, and we also specify through which interface these requests are going to come through. So where this would apply. So that is something that we would do. So that's one of the key differences that we can see there. But in addition to that, there are a number of steps that we will take to do those port-based authentication configuration. But as I said, like we don't need to go into much more detail of how we may do that. But as a summary, when we think about AAA, that is when we think about authentication, authorization, and accounting, and when we think that in the context of securing our networks, we can use them in few different approaches. One is how we connect to our active devices in the network, that is the routers, how we go into the configuration interfaces of the routers and all that. That is one part. The second part is which devices are allowed into our network, and that is again something that we can control. There are additional mechanisms for wireless devices and all that, so we are not going into that much of detailed discussion on those. Some of those you may cover in another module, but that is a basic idea what we try to do here. And to implement AAA, we have two different approaches, or broadly two different approaches. One is a local method and the other one is a server-based method. In the local method, whatever the necessary usernames, password, the information is stored locally in the concerned device. Whereas in a server-based approach, all this information is in a remote server and there should be a communication happening between the remote server and the device to do the AAA activities. And particularly in the context of large networks, we would highly prefer to use server-based authentication. It doesn't mean like that's the only way to do that, but that can be advantageous because we can use a common platform or common authentication, common user account to all the devices. And one of the additional possibilities that we can even use some other authentication server that may be used across the organization for other parts as well. Like say you may use an Active Directory, a Windows Active Directory, an Azure Cloud Directory, some other common authentication standard that you use in the organization. You can interface with that authentication platform, even authorization can be built into that platform, and those can be interfaced with these through some of these AAA communication protocols and used with our networking devices as well. So that is something to keep in mind. So we are sort of largely talking about local and server-based devices. One of the things that you can think about going forward is like we think about a lot of our even the network resources, our devices, when they are being in sort of cloud environments. Again, they are we sort of the cloud, or rather the server-based authentication, server-based AAA can further be extended into sort of how that may differ in a cloud environment. So that is something to keep in mind as well. So that's mainly it for today's discussion on AAA, that is authentication, authorization, and accounting, and how we use them to secure our networks and how we use them to enhance the security of our network and the various components in our network. So that's all for today. Next week, we will go on to some of the discussion topics. We will explore through various discussion topic areas in a number of coming weeks. And we will also have a number of practical sessions as well as part of the lesson. And possibly, if time permits, later on, we may have some guest lectures as well. So as always, if you have any questions, please get back to me, send me an email, send me a message, give me a call, and let's try to keep this module as interactive as possible from the coming discussion sessions especially. So I would highly expect your participation in those weeks. So expecting that. Until next time, thank you for joining in for today's lesson. See you next time. Bye.